friends, let us consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Acuity podcast, Politics and Culture. I'm your host and Chief Executive and Chief Litigator at Acuity Medical Law. As always is my very charming, lovely co-host and the Communications Manager, Amy Ham. We're thrilled to have you guys back. We're going to have another really good episode. We have a bunch of current events that we're going to be talking about. Just to set the stage a little bit, if you have not listened to the last episode that we did with Tristin Hopper of the National Post, I highly recommend you check that out. It was a great conversation. It's a sort of a barometer on where Canada is right now, how we got to where we are. So highly recommend checking that out. And of course, his book, Don't Be Canada. You should buy that and enjoy that. Also, we always put a sort of a caveat at the end where we encourage people to subscribe, follow, retweet, whatever, but I feel like I'm going to do it at the beginning as well. So just a reminder, whatever platform you choose to watch this on, please do whatever it is that people will do. It helps us out, but most importantly, leave comments. We love the comments. We respond to them and we use them for our material and what we're going to talk about. So if you have topics you want to discuss or if you have guests that you want us to interview, then please let us know. Okay? Amy, tell us what's on the agenda.
Absolutely. Or maybe we can do we usually do a little brief introduction about how are things going in Nova Scotia before we jump into the main part.
Yeah. Well, it's good. It's good. It's busy. As you know, a lot of our potential clients, they sort of we wait a little bit of time to see how that file potentially matures, what harms are realized, what's the prognosis for injuries that clients have sustained. And in the last several weeks, a lot of those files have sort of manifest. So it's a bit of a crunch time getting things underway, which is always good and exciting to see that, the viability and strength of a case has really come to fruition. And apart from that, I've had a little bit of a quiet time from the Emerge, which I'm a little grateful for because the firm work has been really busy. So yeah, kind of busy, but pretty good. How about you?
Nice, that's good. Yeah, it's been busy here too. My kids are at ages where one is sort of getting too old to do the summer camp thing all the time. So we've got one at home, one in summer camp, and just trying to make it's hard for kids to understand when you're working from home too. They're like, why are you doing this? Why are you on your computer? I'm here. And you just have to try to mitigate their expectations that you can play with them all day long, because that's what they want. But yeah, I guess the most crazy thing that happened in our household this week was that one of my sons, because we raise tadpoles and then we like to watch the metamorphosis of tadpoles, like frog spawn all the way to frog. And I gave them the opportunity to have their own frog in their own tank, like in their own room, as this sort of you're getting older, you're responsible for this creature, you're going to take care of them. And then one of my kids, within 24 hours of having their own frog to take care of, lost their frog in our house. So somewhere in my house right now is a frog. If a frog hops in the background, that's what's going on, because there's out somewhere in the loose, there's a frog in my house.
Yeah, super cute. I have no idea how annoying that is, or maybe potentially beneficial. I mean, 3 or 4 free frogs in the house, probably bug load is much less, flies are much less. So, I mean, I say that very stereotypically because my only frog knowledge comes from cartoons. Apparently, they are really good at eating flies. I don't know.
Yeah, mosquitoes. Although there really aren't that many mosquitoes when you live in the Lower Mainland. If you get outside and more into a nature or prominent area, there are a lot of mosquitoes. But anyways, yeah, ribbit.
Yeah, that's awesome. To your point about kids and the amount of demand and attention that they seem to need, we have a really big difference between our two. The older one is fully dependent. You kind of can't really leave her alone for 10 minutes or more to do an activity without, Dad, look at this. Dad, what do you think of this? Dad, can you see this? Dad, play with me. Let me show you something. And it's super cute, for the first hour, maybe two, but then it starts to get wow, this is a pretty high demand. I really don't know how my wife does it all. And then the younger one is
Yeah.
like you're a passive participant in her entertainment. She'll go off and do her own thing and come back every once in a while and show you something and then leave, whether it interests you or not. And then she cycles back and forth. So the a huge difference between the two of them.
Yeah, isn't that that's one of my favorite parts of parenthood, is seeing the vast difference in between the way that they are and they develop. And then you sort of, you when you take your psychology classes in early university and you learn about nature versus nurture theory, and then when you actually raise your own kids and you see that, you're like, oh, nature is so much more important than you were maybe led to believe by a lot of these sort of social theorists in universities that act as though nurture is so much more of who we are. Then that's my take anyways, I think.
I totally
And
agree. Yeah, I totally agree.
same with the difference between the sexes, where people are like, oh, boys are only the boys be boys thing is just because they're taught a social role. And I'm like, no, 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 you've never been a parent or like hung out with, because you have girls, I have boys. You got to see the difference between boys and girls, and it's nature.
Yeah,
that's
yeah. The difference
that's what
is
I've learned.
overwhelming. The role of like genetics
Yeah.
in people's predispositions is really can't be understated. I remember like growing up, my dad, like in that generation, grew up where a lot of behavioral psychology was like really, really strong, and you could turn anybody into anything based on their experiences when they're a child. And like today, I think in large part that has been abandoned. There's like there's some component of it that is nurture related, but really it's much, much more strongly associated with their predisposition, their genetics.
Absolutely. Which, and this is a little bit of tangential, but I also, there are these fascinating cases of twin studies where they've wrangled these cases of twins that were separated at birth through adoption. And then you come to find, and there have been, I think, like a handful of cases, which is extraordinary. In terms of like what are the chances that this would happen, but they bring these twins back when they're adults, and then you'll find these twins separated at birth and they have like the same profession. They married women that have the same profession and look the same. And it's just absolutely bizarre. So
Yeah,
I
one of the
think
things that really gets me is I'm 99% sure that it was IQ related, and that the difference between two twins raised separately on IQ, we're talking about identical twins, separated uh, through their sort of like formative years, is smaller than the inter IQ test variability between people. So if I wrote two IQ
yeah,
tests, one of them done by one group and one of them done by another group, the IQ variance between myself and myself on two tests is greater than the difference between two identical twins raised apart who are doing the same IQ test, which is like
that's so wild.
it's like a really intimidating thing to think about, to be honest with you.
Yeah, isn't it? It's very freaky.
Yeah, I mean, like, especially because there are all these consequences about when we talk about like free will and how much ownership and personal responsibility people should have for their own actions, et cetera, et cetera. When you start to go down the rabbit hole of what genetics implies and what a person's actual capacity is and how maximized they are, and like what's the level of inhibition, what's the level of analysis, critical reasoning, et cetera, like what's the role for education, what's the role for university education, can you teach people a lot of these things or not, like you
Yeah,
go down this rabbit hole and suddenly you're like, I don't even know if any of this makes any difference at all, right? So
yeah.
in some ways it's kind of fascinating, and in other ways it's very intimidating, and I try not to think about it too much.
It is. It's one of those. It's like me when I watch these reels. My algorithm, when it's late at night, it starts sending me things about physics, the universe, astronomy, and it just starts making me question absolutely everything that I've been doing and thinking about throughout the day. I'm like, what is the meaning and point of the universe? This is wild. There's so much that's out of our control and unknowable. So I think we should maybe have a whole episode talking about twin studies, because that would actually be really cool to
Yeah,
look at what's been discovered.
I remember these my first degree was in psychology and neuroscience, and I had a minor in math, and the like neuroscience of learning development was like one of my favorites. One of my favorite classes I took was with a gentleman named Professor Lombardi, and he taught us the neuroscience of learning and development. Man, that was like very interesting, and it plays a role in how algorithms sort of like use psychology to get you addicted, and what is the best defense against these kinds of biases and psychologies, and like how much of a defense can you mount against them, all those kinds of questions. Yeah, like super interesting stuff. And I mean, like, I'm sure it'll come up in the context of our conversations with like different guests, right? Like eventually we'll have Deborah So on, and if we talk to her about sex differences and sexuality, like all these kinds of things are super interesting conversation to have about people.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay. That said, why don't we get into our actual scripted content for this episode? And, going after our interview with Tristin Hopper last week about Don't Be Canada, everything's wrong and bad about Canada, and then shifting into what's going on in politics and culture. And again, it's like, I'm sorry to say, but there's a lot of bad stuff going on in Canada, which leads me
Yeah.
to the first topic, which is that so June 18th, 2026, Bill C-9 received royal assent. This is the Combating Hate Act. And since that has happened, it hasn't been very long, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, of which the president, John Carpe, we've had on the podcast before, check out that episode, his organization is announcing that Canadians are reporting to their organization that they're being contacted in their homes. Police are knocking on their doors about their social media posts, whether it was made months ago or even years ago. And this is obviously extremely chilling and concerning for Canadians. And it's sort of, I think we've also smugly looked at the UK and gone, hey, we're not that bad. We don't, in the UK, there have been hundreds of stories of police knocking on doors about social media posts. And now, under Mark Carney's government and with the passage of Bill C-9, it's happening in Canada. And so the Justice Center has put this public call out, and they're saying, if it's happening to you, contact us because we want to help. And I just find it so disheartening that we're going down this path under Mark Carney's Liberal government. It's not surprising. When Trudeau was still in power, he had this Anti-Hate Act legislation that was really horrific, even worse than this legislation that just passed, because it also talked about forming like this body similar to an HRT or Human Rights Tribunal, where people would be able to make complaints, anonymous complaints even, and even about speech that hadn't occurred yet, and it would have been sort of persecuting Canadians over their speech. And when Trudeau quit the Liberal Party, he prorogued Parliament. That bill died. When Parliament prorogues, all of the bills on the table go away. And everyone suspected Mark Carney's government will bring back a similar bill. And so this C9 is an example of a similar bill that he's brought back. And we're seeing the ramifications already, like after a month. So I find this very terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, so most Canadians, most people in the West, unfortunately, I think lean towards the idea that some hateful speech should not be protected. I think most people do. I think that the concept of like the U.S. First Amendment and the right to be like deeply offensive and all those kinds of things doesn't really ring very much for most people in the West, which I think is unfortunate. I think that free speech advocates, much to Tristin Hopper's point, have really rested on their laurels for many, many decades and thought to themselves, like, this is not a fight that is needed to have. And in large part, the problem with that is that when the fight does come, you are underprepared, that the average person does not have the knowledge base to be able to appropriately reject such bad ideas. And the threshold that we should all have in society for free speech is a very, very high one of protection. Like outside
Yeah.
a very, very narrow window of what is obviously defamatory, which includes a harm component, right? So like if I was to say something offensive to someone, but there's no component of harm, even if it was largely false, then I think that should even still that should be protected. But like knowing that something is a lie, perpetuating it to the harm of someone should obviously be something that people should be protected against. And of course, like the immediate calls for violence, and that violence can come in like multiple forms, right? Like, posting people's public addresses and saying, hey, if anybody chooses to do X or Y, then here it is. That might not be like the immediate call to violence, but it's just sort of like the enabling of it. So there are some obvious safeguards that should be in place. But in general, free speech exists to defend people I disagree with from saying things I dislike. And that should be the mantra that everybody should hold very, very close to them. So,
Yeah.
like there is a profound anti-Christian sentiment out there. It comes in all forms of media, whether it's like formalized art, songs, musicals, performances, concerts, or comics, whatever the case might be. Despite the fact that I might find some offense to it, I might find that it's offensive. I don't care at all. I don't care at all. I very much appreciate that people should be allowed to be as offensive as they care to be outside of the very narrow window of protections that they should have against harm from speech. So to me, these kinds of things are absolutely tyrannical. I see no real reason
Yeah.
to think otherwise.
I totally agree. My personal position is of free speech absolutism. And I think that if someone is going to even be a terrorist, be hateful, be openly racist, I want to hear what they have to say. I don't want them to go into hiding and not say it. I think there's a social benefit to hearing it and being able to counter that speech in public. And then, of course, like you mentioned, defamation or doxing someone, those I think are issues that can be addressed in civil law, because, defamation that caused damages that can be proven in court, fine. I think that's totally fair. And this is, in terms of legislating against hatred, it's so fraught. And I don't trust that any government can ever do that without it being a slippery slope. And as you see in Bill C-9, part of what this bill did was it added to the criminal code a definition of hatred, which is insane. It's like they're defining emotion into law. And so what they said is that the law defines hatred as an emotion of an intense and extreme nature that is clearly associated with vilification and detestation. The law also specifies what is not hatred, namely acts that solely humiliate, discredit, hurt, or offend. But that's the end of the quote. The problem here is that there are a lot of verbs in here. And so you're going to define hate, but then you're not going to similarly try and define vilification, detestation, humiliation, discrediting or discreditation, hurt, or offense. So all of these are highly subjective terms that can be subject to abuse by the powers that be. And this is just simply not legislation that should exist. We already had a criminal code that, it was illegal to incite violence directly. There's no reason. We have defamation laws. There's no reason for this legislation to exist other than the government is trying to exert more control and more power over what persons are allowed to say. And, again, I think going back to the very issue, and maybe you can speak to it as a lawyer, like trying to define in law an emotion and to sort of outlaw an emotion, in this case hate, is so nonsensical and frankly terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, like, unfortunately, the courts have had to grapple with problems like this repeatedly in the past with sort of like nebulous concepts that need to be sort of like delineated and defined. And they go through like a whole exercise of trying to understand the legislative intent and, like balancing the different pros and cons in society and so on. So like they have a process by which they go through it. And like, to be honest, in general, they do a very good job. The problem is that this is like a frog that's boiling very slowly. Just as we've seen with MAID, and we've seen with many other topics in Canada, it starts with one way and then it very slowly, gradually pushes boundaries and gets further and further. And then ultimately the Overton window has shifted enough, the chilling effect has happened enough, the self-censorship has already taken place, the consequences of society have already manifest. And so the harms go unaddressed for a very long time if they're addressed at all. So that's like a huge problem with trying to tackle something so nebulous. Like John Green, this famous writer who has written The Fault in Our Stars. He has a huge publication library on YouTube that I watched when I was younger. He's a bit of a leftist, but he's a very bright guy. And one of the things that he talks about is like you don't start a war against a noun. So like a war on poverty, a war on terrorism, like those kinds of things are always fraught with like pitfall after pitfall because they are too nebulous, right? And the goalposts tend to move and the government tends to overextend and so on. And so like in this instance, it's like combating hate. It's like my dude,
Yeah.
you're trying to combat something that sits in the heart of every human being, and you're trying to do it like through legislation and police and policing and thought policing and so on. It's like this is an extremely dangerous territory. Everyone should read. Everyone, regardless of your profession, regardless of your walk of life, regardless of your political persuasion, everyone should read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill is one of the most
Yes.
brilliant political
Yes.
philosophers, a British gentleman in 1850 something, wrote On Liberty. He goes through all the arguments of protection, specifically on the liberty and the right to freedom of expression. And it's the most comprehensive argument in favor of giving everyone the right to say like tremendously offensive things. And to your
Yeah.
point, of course, Amy, he addresses exactly what you said, that it protects the argument about what is right and what is wrong to think has to happen in the open market of ideas, and people have to be able to debate them in the context of offensive ideas that are described. So if we try to mitigate or shortchange what ideas are discussed because they are hateful or offensive, we do everyone in society a huge discredit by weakening the arguments against them, by making people forget the history of why bad ideas are bad,
Yeah.
and so many other things, right? Like people learn more, people get better at argumentation in general. So he goes
Yeah.
through a huge long list.
So that is one of my favorite books in the world. So incredible, and partly why I am a free speech absolutist. And like you said, that to do what this government is trying to do with this legislation would create what Mill would argue is like you have these people, and rather than allowing them to think for themselves, to understand why liberty is important and why free speech is important, you're just hoping that they'll believe you when the powers that be say, hey, here's what is right, and just trust me and believe that that is right, rather than allowing every person, whether or not they have the capacity to go through the stage of critical thinking to determine for themselves. And it's such a just an assault on every person's liberty to take that away from them. And that's essentially what it's doing too. Is, there's this nanny state in Canada that's like, I'm going to protect you from harms, from hurty words, from feeling offended. And it's like, you're not protecting people, you are taking away their liberty to self-actualize and to think their way through these issues and to understand liberty and freedom from the get-go.
Totally.
It is harm. And you also talked about trying to say to sort of legislate against a noun. And the flip side would be, imagine we had laws, not just you're not allowed to hate, but it was like you have to love. You have to love this group. You have to do this. What's the difference between? There is no difference between the two. They're equally as absurd. And for some
Totally.
reason, we allow one. We don't allow the other because I guess we'd understand that that's just absolutely ridiculous. But I would hope that people understand both are ridiculous. Saying you're
Yeah.
hate is a human condition. You cannot legislate hate away, nor do I think you can define it in law.
Yeah, I think that the procedural way to try and define it is going to be fraught with peril. I think that you'll find no court is going to be eager to take up that challenge once like this has crossed some kind of threshold and reaches some kind of trier of fact. I don't think anybody's going to be particularly eager to try and wrestle with that problem. So yeah, I think that to your point, pragmatically, this is like very very difficult to do. And then, like you said, Jordan Peterson is very famous for saying the reason that speech is so important, and the reason that the right to speech is so important, is because it is a reflection of the right to think. So if you cannot articulate your
Yeah.
thoughts in public, then you're really stunting your ability to think. and controlling people's thoughts through censorship, through the chilling effect, is absolutely perilous. It's a path of disparity. It's a totalitarianism, and so on. So, yeah, I think that this is like particularly nefarious. And I mean, like, you can look at it because, in history, who are the ones who try to do these kinds of things, right? I mean, like, is this something that the heroes in history, that the good guys in history try to do, or is this something that the villains in history try to do, right? Like, one of the huge markers of a free and successful, prosperous Western society is this right that is literally being curtailed. But we should try
Yeah.
to steel man the position, of course. I mean, like, we've done a pretty good job in trying to undermine and poke the holes in it. But I mean, like, I think you and I would both agree that there is certainly a rise in anti-Semitism. I don't think that there's a rise in Islamophobia. I think that there is a
Yeah.
tremendous debate online in theological apologetics, which I love. I'm totally fixated in this fight online. So, like, Muslims debating Christians, Christians debating Jews, and so on. And I think that that's like an incredible thing for society. And then personally, it's extremely interesting. But I mean, like, does the government have a responsibility to try and curtail anti-Semitism?
No, they don't. They don't. And this is something, aside from punished to the severest extent of the law, the persons who firebomb synagogues, of course. But and this was over a year ago. This post October 7th, when we were seeing all of these rallies, including on the steps of the Vancouver Art Gallery, in which um, a woman who is one of the founders of what's now known as a terrorist group in Canada, Samidoun, they were out there burning Canadian flags and saying death to Israel, death to Canada. And so a lot of people were extremely offended, of course, and they said they shouldn't be allowed to do that. And I remember at the time pitching a National Post column, and I said, I want to write about how they should be allowed to say this. And I think the headline was "Let the Terrorists Speak so we know who they are." And I still stand by that. It's like, I want to know what these people are thinking. I don't want to push them underground. Let them say it on the streets. And I think that the fact that that happened, it was shortly after that Samidoun was finally, after years, designated by the Canadian government as a terrorist organization. And they've, I'm sure CSIS started looking more into their funding. And it's like, if you don't allow these people to speak, then it's all going to be happening still under our noses, but we won't maybe be able to thwart further synagogue bombings or whatever. I think there's no benefit to stopping speech. Like, so what if you're offended? I could care less about being offended by anyone, or even in the most egregious ways. I literally don't care.
And then in the same context, if we remove like the sort of hateful component of it, if we just look at, falsities that are perpetuated, like, I hesitate to use the word like disinformation, but let's just say that it was some sort of disinformation. For example, let's just say some very popular conservative pundit, or sort of like progressive pundit, puts out a, like, scathing report online, puts on a reel, and talks about a lot of things that they label Israel as having done, and they are lies, and that this stokes a huge firestorm and goes out there, and there are not, let's just say, harmful consequences, like in terms of like physical violent harm, but let's just say that, like, mobilizes mass amounts of people to, like, withdraw from donations, or they vote differently or whatever, but it's all because of a lie. Does the government have a role in trying to mitigate the harm from falsehoods that are perpetuated?
Again, I think not. And I do recognize, also working in media, that misinformation or disinformation can be major issues. There are a lot of sort of journalism adjacent, quote unquote, influencers that they rush to get a story out. They share false information. I get infuriated by this sometimes. It really pisses me off. But again, it always has to go back to sort of the argument of John Stuart Mill, I think, in that you've got to let people receive all the information and figure it out for themselves. It's I think it's arrogance to think that you should be able to sort of be in control of any sort of narrative, and not allow people to think for themselves otherwise. So it's really tricky, especially in the social media age, because obviously when John Stuart Mill was writing, this didn't exist. There was not a glut of information 24/7, and people sharing things that are half true, completely untrue, sometimes true, and we weren't left to try to sift through heaps and heaps and heaps of sometimes just absolute garbage to try and arrive at the truth. And I think we are seeing in our culture some moral and intellectual confusion because of this issue. But again, I would still go back to my principles about freedom and liberty and free speech absolutism. I think no matter what, I would hang on to those.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the big crux of like the questions are: does the government have a responsibility to insert? And the answer in both of these instances is no. Like I think that society has a role to intervene. I think the average person has a role to intervene. I think that platforms have a role to intervene. Right? Like so, I think famously at this point on X, Elon introduced the community notes method of sort of fact checking, and everyone has
Great
agreed that that is
system.
it is. Everyone has agreed that that's the best system by far. Zuckerberg admitted it, and he's very slow to drag his feet. Although there isn't anything particularly controversial that's floating around in Facebook right now that he probably feels the impetus to address immediately. It's not like COVID times or whatever. But I mean, like all the censorship apparati, whether it was like fact checkers at platforms who were overtly putting their thumbs on the scale, like all of these things to government, like outright banning things, like all of these things have been shown to be a very, very poor option. And instead, we have community notes, which is by votes from the average person, a smaller group of people who are trusted to go online and criticize and publish the criticism, and the criticism itself can be criticized as well. And so
Yeah.
that facilitation of the market for ideas is by far the best, and it is
Yeah.
incumbent on us to use our discernment to help support people who have that kind of critical thinking ability, and we have the responsibility to not broadcast and empower people who lack that discernment. So, like I think that this kind of like touches on the idea of like the culture wars currently on the right, whether it's the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens versus more centrist groups versus the Daily Wire and so on. So I mean, like how and you pick to choose your attention, where you pick to choose how you assign your money, because ultimately money is how we vote for these kinds of entities, right? Like that's incumbent on each of us. The government stepping in and saying, well, you know what, this is a trusted source and this is not, and so we support these people and we don't support others, or the journalistic standards in this group of people are different and they use authorities that we prefer and respect, and so on and so on. I think the government, once they start to get involved in the promulgation of ideas, like that's already a very, very bad idea, right? Like
It
there
is.
seems to be very little saving grace to that.
Yeah, you note at the beginning of this website that was on the screen earlier where they're talking about the passage of C-9, and they said, why it's happening. And it said rising anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia. And the ironic thing here is that I agree with you. Anti-Semitism, that is a rising problem. Islamophobia, no, I don't think it is. You agree with that? Homophobia, yes, I agree. Transphobia, no, I don't agree. And these are like two sides of the same coins where anti-Semitism, Islamophobia go together, and they're sort of adding Islamophobia in to not piss off the anti-Semites, I think. And then it's the same thing could be said with transphobia, because when the government says that transphobia is on the rise, what they mean is that people have had enough of gender ideology telling us that men are women and they are allowed to invade our sports, our rape shelters, our prisons, and they're claiming that that is transphobic, and it's not. That's bullshit.
Exactly.
And
So I
then
mean, like you can see
when
how,
they're saying,
exactly to your point, all the spilling, right? Like, okay, so we're going to combat
yeah,
hate, and we're going to label hate in all these different ways that aren't even synonymous with one another. And so, how we're going
yeah,
to identify transphobia? Well, we're going to say it's any of these things, which then lead to transphobia, which is under the definition of hate, and so on and so on. So, I mean, like, it's just
yeah,
a slippery slope after a slippery slope. It's not something that people should be able to, like, especially a group of bureaucrats, with elections being what they are, with people crossing party lines and giving majorities where they are undeserved, right? I mean, like, how much one of the things I always say is like government should be particularly weak, right? Like government should not have the opportunity to make such huge sweeping categorizations because in general, they don't represent a majority of people. And that's the same everywhere, right? Like, so in Canada, the number of the citizens of Canada who have voted on behalf of Liberal policies is far, far fewer than 51%. Even 51% should not be enough because on any specific issue like this one, you might have even less of a percentage of support. And so for a government to
Yeah.
come in and make a decision like this in the absence of overwhelming support, a referendum, 70%, 60%, 80% of people who are eligible to vote, et cetera, et cetera. Like this is a government taking power where it should not feel any authorization to do that.
It's really fucked up.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
Frankly, it's
yeah.
it's terrifying. And if you hear a knock on the door while we're recording, it might be the police knocking on our doors because I'm sure we've said things that people in Canada, I know I have for sure, said things that people would love to have me arrested for. So
Oh yeah, you're doomed,
I
Amy. You're doomed.
yeah, I genuinely, I won't be surprised at this point to get a knock on my door after C-9. I
Oh
won't.
yeah.
And I'll be infuriated, but I wouldn't be surprised. And that is horrifying. That's the country that we live in. So maybe on that note, we can shift to that. We have one more bad news Canada story, and then actually a nice one. So the next one I wanted to talk about just how emasculated Prime Minister Mark Carney has been by President Trump over, I mean, over his entire reign, but in particular in the last several weeks, Carney has just been taking a beating from Trump. So sort of the latest, Trump is now imposing new 50% tariffs on many products. He's even blaming Mark Carney for the weather, essentially, and for wind patterns. He's saying the smoke coming from Canadian wildfires going into the US is poisoning their air. He would like Canada to potentially pay fines for this. And something else that has happened is, so there's this new bridge opening. It's the Gordie Howe Bridge. And so back in 2012, then conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper signed an agreement with the US that this bridge would be built. It's between Windsor, Ontario and Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan. And at the time, this agreement that a conservative government signed would have given, because Canada paid for this bridge, we were supposed to be getting all of the tolls until the money that we sunk into this bridge was paid back. Lo and behold, Carney has now been lying to the public, and it's just come out that he's signed a new deal with the US, and now he's giving 50%. It's going to be 50-50 for 15 years. And any of the money that Canada gets from this bridge, rather than paying for the cost of the bridge, will instead be for servicing the bridge, snow removal, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, Carney got completely screwed. And rather than own up to it, he's lying to the public. He's trying to cover up. And he's just looking like an absolute fool
Yeah.
under
And
Trump.
I'll
Like
tell you what my
there's,
big thing here Amy, is like this isn't even a bad deal. You know what I mean? Like this isn't a bad deal. The problem is the posturing, the rhetoric beforehand. Like, Carney has overpromised and therefore everything is under delivering. Like you come out and you identify to Canadians, but it's all this elbows up nonsense and it's posturing and it's putting yourself in a position that your own policies are going to undermine and defeat because you have not liberalized Canadian energy, you haven't liberalized Canadian markets, you haven't deregulated to allow an explosion in privatization, you haven't brought in any foreign investments because who the fuck would invest in Canada right now, right? Like, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, you've been on a warpath for a year. You're talking about, like this huge speech at Davos that this is now a new multipolar world and you're going to extend your hand to parties across the globe instead of like your most powerful, the hegemon of the world, who's also your closest neighbor and your closest economic power partner. And then you're going to still rant and rail against them. And then you're going to have deals like this, which is like not even all that bad. Like, how else would somebody divide the way that this bridge between Canada and the US would be managed? It's like this. So, I mean, like, anybody looking at this objectively would have said, well, more or less what we hoped. It would have been nice to get a little bit more. It would have been nice to give a little bit less, but this is reality. And instead, you look like a moron because you've been posturing inappropriately, all because you are trying to rally Canadian support for you. Okay, there's some political strategy to that. and you're trying to like label Trump as the enemy. Okay, fine. I don't begrudge you the political strategy there, but you're denying reality, and a denial of reality is going to lead you to these kinds of huge problems. So, I mean, like, this is unfortunately, Canadians should wake up and realize that all the
Yeah.
posturing and all this antagonism towards the United States is completely misplaced, totally misplaced.
Yeah.
They don't deserve that kind of
Yeah.
animosity, and we can work very well with them. I think it was a conservative who said, he had a great line. I don't think it was Ford. No, it was Scott Moe. Scott Moe said, great line.
Oh yeah.
We should be having a trade deal, not a trade war with the United States. Right. Does
Right.
this feel
Yeah.
like deal making? Is any of this rhetoric
No.
deal making? Nothing at all.
No.
Right?
No. And the antagonism that we're seeing come, and all of the sort of lefty, David Eby is doing it, Ford is doing it out in Ontario, and it's the same posturing. It reminds me of, I have got a like 20-pound Boston Terrier, and he doesn't like the train. Like a train goes through our neighborhood sometimes at low speed, and the train horn goes, and his hackles get up and he's barking at the train. I'm like, wait, you're a 20-pound dog. You can't bark at the train. And that's what I see Carney doing to the US, and
So
like,
true.
and Eby and Ford. It's like, you guys stop this ridiculous posturing. It's nonsense. And I maybe disagree about the fact that it's a good deal, because I think already was a deal in place under a former government, and it was that we would get all of the revenues until we recouped our costs. So we got knocked down a peg, and I think that's a direct result of how bad Carney is at negotiating with Trump, despite being elected on a platform that was what he would be good at doing. And my blood was boiling this morning because I saw a CBC headline. The CBC is just a propaganda machine. And so the CBC's headline this morning about this deal that's now, I think the government posted it online last night and revealed the details, but Carney has been telling press over the last week different details and sort of obscuring and lying about it. So the CBC headline was, text of new Gordie Howe bridge deal seems to contradict Carney proposed agreement. And I'm like, come on. The CBC won't even come out and be like, Carney lied. Carney said the wrong thing. It's like, oh, it seems to contradict. Like, come on. And this is partly why we still have Carney getting so much support, is that we've got this government funded propaganda machine, the CBC, behind him,
Exactly.
filling Canadians' heads with nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's like, unfortunately, it's such a great tragedy in Canada that the CBC remains the level of authority that it seems to. But to us, it's like a tremendous source of entertainment, because, I mean, like, you read this and it's kind of like reading Russia Today. I mean, like, it's just an extension of the government. They're basically, everything there is going to be passed and filtered in whatever is the most positive lens, specifically for the liberals. Yeah, it's just carrying their water. To your point about the agreement not being as strong for us as it could have been, you're right. You are right. My only point is that, like, on its face, looking at this, it's not a unreasonable set of compromises or concessions to make. Like, this is within the realm of negotiating to try and figure out how and people are going to divvy up revenue. So, of
Yeah.
course, it's not as good as it could be, and arguably in the most just world that it should be. But given the strength and the nature of the U.S. and Canada as it is now, this is something where the average Canadian would be like, okay, well, it is what it is. But all this posturing and antagonism that has been fomented by the government and propagated by liberal media is just doing so much harm to the average Canadian, right? Like, psychologically, you try to look at this and try to put things back together. You think to yourself, now the prime minister is lying, or maybe we're not in a strong position, but I've been told to hate America, and I've been told not to travel there and spend my money on American alcohol, or whatever the case might be. And it's like, my guy, do you not see how stupid you're being? Do you not see how stupid the government is being? Do you think that this is the appropriate way to negotiate with a superpower that we depend upon, that we are also great allies with?
Yeah. And I know, when we were entering election territory, Trump said that he would prefer Carney over Poilievre. And this is why, because he knew that he could strong arm Carney into whatever the hell he wanted. He saw Carney as weak, because he is weak. As far as I'm concerned, he's a weak, pathetic man. I've had maybe the displeasure of meeting him in person. And it's like, not only mentally is he weak, he stammers, he won't answer questions, he walks away, he loses his temper on reporters. He doesn't tell the truth. He doesn't have enough respect for people to give them straight answers to
Totally.
questions.
And
He's a
going back to the
liar,
first part
I
of our
think.
segment, right? If he lives in a sheltered, protected bubble, he is used to a certain
Yeah.
quality and capacity of media interrogation and criticism. He exists in a certain echelon of society where everyone is uniform, and he's not in the marketplace of ideas to duke it out. And so he is fragile, and that is a huge
Yeah.
problem, right? His thoughts, his answers go untested, which is why he avoids question period all the time. It's spectacular to me how much this guy avoids his biggest and most important job, talking
Yeah.
transparently to the opposition so that everyone in Canada can listen. And so Trump, of course, saw that. And behind all of that fragility, because I mean, like, just look at him. He looks weak, like
He's
phenotypically,
frail.
you know, like,
He's tiny and frail.
right.
He's tiny
Yeah.
and
So I
frail.
mean, like,
Yeah.
even if we look past all of that, we look at the policies that he was espousing and the policies that he has enacted in his previous roles, and they are to the detriment of that society. And so, what would be better for Trump in order to be able to leverage the strength of the U.S. against a weaker Canada or against a stronger one? Of course, you know, he pretends that he wants strong allies and he wants to encourage them to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But he wants to be in a position of leverage. And the leverage comes from a relative weakness in the opposing party. So, of course, you know, like if Pierre was out here unleashing everything and making everything great and energy was booming and the price of the value of the Canadian dollar was skyrocketing, as opposed to what we're seeing now, right? Like, and we're not in a recession. People love to talk about a technical recession. We are just in a recession. We can just call it what it is. It doesn't need any kind of descriptor, right? It's like social justice versus justice. This is not a technical recession. This is a recession. And
Yeah.
so this is all to Trump's benefit. And then we don't have the musculature to do anything with respect, you know, like to our waters, and the U.S. is going to encroach on that. We don't have anything that we're going to be able to do to try and entice and keep Alberta. And so, like, the prospect of a free Alberta is obviously always on the horizon, which Trump, of course, will leverage. That would be the end of Canada, and so on and so on. So, I mean, like, all of this because we've got terrible policies and a terribly weak prime minister. And this is a testament to that, right? Like, it's a great example of that.
Yeah. And I'm sure that had Poilievre been able to run against Trudeau, and he clearly would have won, I suspect that we would be in a far better position with our relations with the US. And I also suspect that were we in that better position right now, the CBC would just be railing against him and saying it
Of course.
should be even better, and that if Carney was in there, it would have been even better. And it's like, no, we are in the hole. We are in the shit. This is like, it's about as bad as it can get between the US and Canada right now. This doesn't go much lower at this point. It's quite depressing. Like, Mexico's having a better time with the
Much
US
better.
right now
What's her
than
name?
we are.
Shenenbaum, Scheinbaum, something like that. In Mexico, like she's
Scheinbaum,
having,
yeah.
yeah, she's having a great time negotiating, trying to prepare things for the collapse of the USMCA, or CUSMA, as we say in Canada. Like, you know, so like, yeah, they have lots of prospects that we don't, and this is largely poor tactic, and this is also largely rhetoric driven. But we have some levity. We always like to end on a semi-happy note, so it's not all doom and gloom here.
It's the Acuity podcast, moment of levity, moment of levity.
This is way better than the previous thoughtful
Yeah.
retrospective style. So tee it up, Amy. What do we have?
Well, okay, let's talk about the good news story. Cosbar, Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, did this billboard truck. So a billboard, I think Rebel News owns this billboard truck. It's a huge sort of freighter sized truck, and it has LED screens on the back and both sides. And so they drove this truck right down into Toronto, the final FIFA game, and displaying a message about getting men out of women's sports. And Mark can play the video for us. It was really a really lovely message, and thousands of people walked by. And so that was just a really, thousands and thousands of people saw this message leaving the FIFA celebration. This is the sort of stuff that we need more of this in Canada, because
Yeah.
it's so powerful and so positive, and just I can only imagine. I would be so excited to see something anti-woke like that. I do, and it reminds me, there was just this other, maybe I should have queued this up too. There was this coffee shop in Spokane, Washington, which is just south of where I am, and they really offensively, which again goes to the difference between hate speech laws in Canada versus the US. They made several drinks that had names like a TDS latte, and they actually put a sign up outside of their building that said trans women are R word. I won't say it. I think we might get censored on YouTube if I say it. Men. And he was like, okay, I'm not saying this to either endorse or deny that message, but it's obviously really offensive, and it's obviously funny. And that's the sort of stuff that you can get away with when you actually live in a country that protects your free speech, but not in Canada. So I think, this billboard truck to me is like, I love seeing these like good signs of resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, very positive prognostic indicator. I was really, really heartened. Sophie Cunningham, the now world famous WNBA player, who was famous for finger pointing during a match at somebody who was acting particularly egregiously on the court. So she had some kind of a post recently contesting the fact that men should not be in women's sports. So yeah, I mean, like it's great to see these. These are all victories. It's a victory in the moment, and it heralds a greater victory on the horizon. This is an 80-20 issue easily, if not more. And so the tide should turn if people are emboldened, and if their opinions are normalized enough that they will be able to feel comfortable enough to speak up. But importantly, the fight is never over, right? Just like we said at the beginning of the show, one of the things that happens is that when it comes to free speech, you think that you live in a free speech country, and then you stop fighting for it, you stop arguing for it, and then it becomes at risk. So just because the tide is turning, that does not mean this is over. This fight is very well alive in Canada. Unfortunately, like Tristin Hopper said last week, and as he expounds in his book, we are the worst country in the world on this front. And so the fight certainly continues, but these are really good positive markers to show that the tide is turning.
They are. And maybe as a final note and a joke. So you mentioned Sophie Cunningham. She's the WNBA player that did the finger pointing that turned into a huge meme, which is hilarious. And a joke that I heard about that, which had me just absolutely like cracking up, like belly laughter, is someone said, the most exciting thing to ever happen in the WNBA that got them the most attention. It has nothing to do with like the sports or the game or anything. It's just women pointing at each other.
Yeah, it's like the drama within the sport. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
All the power in the world to her. She's using her newfound attention in the best way possible.
Yeah.
And I mean, like,
Yeah.
I don't know if it makes any sense to you, Amy, but like, when I had seen her prior to this, she seemed like a pretty girl, an excellent athlete, certainly an excellent athlete, but she has like a newfound glow. I don't know what it is. Like
Yeah.
like a holy spirit in her. You can see some kind of light manifest in her, and she has like a radiance about her,
Yeah.
right? And so like
I see
people
that.
embracing the truth,
see that.
right? Yeah, you embrace the
That's
truth
it.
that you know inside of you,
Yeah.
and it comes out.
The culture is sick. And when you stand up for what's right and what's good and true, I think you feel that. It sickens your soul to go along with lies.
Yeah.
And that maybe more people need to think about that, because whatever you might pay costs for speaking out, but your soul will feel good and free. And I
That's right.
agree with you. I can see that when I look at her too.
Yeah. So great moment of levity to round out the conversation. Thanks everyone once again for tuning in this week to Amy and I on the Acuity podcast. Like, subscribe, follow, all those kinds of things, but post your comments and let us know what you want to see in the future. We have a fantastic guest next week. We cannot wait to sit down and talk to James Lindsay. We really recommend that you'll tune in next week. But in the meantime, check us out on X and see what he does. We'll post some of the things that we'll talk about with him. So follow along and get ready for a great conversation with James Lindsay next week.
Friends, let us consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.